thanks for having me. It is great to be here. And do, finish your tacos. I'm a great dinner entertainment, hopefully. So, it's great to be here. What I want to do with my time is really look at one big question, and it's a why question. And the question is, and I think you'll feel this, why does it feel right now like ministry is just so hard? Why does it feel like being a pastor or being a youth worker? Why does it feel so hard? I'm just going to answer this right off the bat, and the reason is because of the secular. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Here's the problem with saying, what's the challenge is the secular, is that the secular is a very slippery word. If we had time, and I was to have cards on your table right now, I haven't done this, so don't worry about it. But I was to ask you to write your definition of the secular on one of those cards, and we were to gather those and look for commonalities, try to find a single definition. My guess is we'd have a lot of overlap, but there would also be some differences. And so whenever you say things like the challenge of ministry today is the secular, or the church is facing a secular time, what becomes really clear in those conversations is we're not really sure what we mean. So let me unfold this word secular, because it's a very slippery word, and see if it doesn't help us answer this question, why ministry feels so hard right now. So go with me. I requested a time machine be here, and I was told that it was being used somewhere else tonight. So I apologize for not having a time machine here, but I want you to step back in time. But I also want you to think about this as we go on this historical journey for a few minutes. I also want you to think not just about history, I want you to think about how this changes our imagination. So step back with me in time and let's go to a period when there was no such thing as the secular. I know that seems really weird, but there was in the Western world. If we even went back 500 or 600 years from now, if we could get in that time machine, you would enter a world where there was no secular. Now that doesn't mean people didn't know the difference between what was sacred and what was profane. And by profane I don't mean gross or bad, I just simply mean was not used in the holy exercise. And people of course knew that a priest's chalice and the shovel of a farmer were two very different things. But for the most part, it all held together. It was all one whole thing. And if you were in Paris in the 13th or 14th century, you would be in a place where there really was no secular. There was no secular at all. Matter of fact, it'd be very hard in the secular zero world to find any atheists. It'd be hard to find anyone who didn't believe in God. As a matter of fact, if you went to Venice today, Venice, Italy, you could walk around the canals and you would find this statue. Now, if anyone knew who this statue was of, I would be very impressed, and you'd have to be a major statue nerd. But this is actually a statue of a man named Paolo Sarpi. Does anyone know who Paolo Sarpi is? So Paolo Sarpi is famous for being Galileo's friend. And so he was the one who encouraged Galileo to write his book. But if you go to Venice today, you can find the statue off the Grand Canal. And when you find it, you'll see that underneath it is a plaque that says that this is Paolo Sarpi, and it gives his date of his birth and the date of death. But then there's a quote in Italian. And so you'll have to find an Italian person to translate it for you. But this is what the quote says, and it's really quite fascinating. It says, Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation. The only unbeliever of his generation. This is mid-16th century. And if you were an unbeliever at that time who lived, well, you got a statue. I don't think the traffic would be any better in Dallas-Fort Worth if you got a statue for every non-believer in the Metroplex. I think it'd be pretty hard to drive. But in a secular zero world, it's nearly impossible to not believe. Belief was everywhere. Now, it's hard for us to imagine what it would be even like to live in a secular zero world. I mean, it seems like such a kind of fantasy place. It's hard to imagine what it would be like to be in a modern world and then go back to a secular zero world. And there's only one thought experiment I know that's tried to imagine what that would be like. And it's quite a frightening thought experiment. And it's this TV show that's now in its 5th season called The Handmaid's Tale. Has anyone seen The Handmaid's Tale? Yeah. If you want to not sleep tonight, watch the first season of The Handmaid's Tale. It is a freaky dystopian show. It's based off these novels by the Canadian novelist Margaret Atwood. And it's a thought experiment of what would happen if America fell. And America doesn't exist anymore, which actually isn't true if you watch the shows. America does exist, but it exists as a small enclave inside Toronto, which honestly, folks, she's a Canadian author. Doesn't that just seem like the ultimate Canadian fantasy? Like America is just a small enclave of Toronto. But this very right-wing religious group has taken over America, renamed it Gilead. And what's quite fascinating about it is a secular zero world. The way you dress, the way you talk, that liturgy spills everywhere. One of the most frightening things of the show is to watch these women go to the supermarket and then reenact the liturgy. May the Lord open under his eye. And the way you dress is your station before God and before the society. That belief in the way you function in society is all really one whole cloth. Now, Margaret Atwood thinks it's absolutely frightening. I mean, this is a dystopian tale. She thinks it's just frightening to imagine that a modern world could slide back into a secular zero world. And she thinks that's frightening because you need three things in a secular zero world that we just don't have anymore. And these three things are, you need to have a deep sense that the world is an enchanted place. And by that I mean you need to have a certain sense that there are demons and devils around every corner. And that you need to be aware of that. And in a larger societal frame, we just don't tend to function that way. Doesn't mean some people and individuals don't, but as a larger kind of society, we tend not to. Connected with that is you need to have a sense that things themselves, the things you touch, they can be imbued with either a divine force or an evil force. And if you're near them, it will impact you. So that third thing is that you have to have an idea that yourself, that your very being, the essence of who you are, is quite porous. In other words, if you're near that evil thing, it can get into your very being and can corrupt it or can make it evil in itself. To live in a secular zero world, you need to have those three things. Now, we just tend not to have those anymore. Those have all, in some sense, disappeared or at least come under significant amounts of doubt. But if you were a pastor or a ministry leader in a secular zero world, it would be very hard to find yourself in an identity crisis. Inside a world where enchantment and things are imbued with the divine force, and you're the spiritual leader and controls or protects those divine things, the sense that if you preach a sermon, it could go right into someone's being and affect them, it'd be very hard to feel like you didn't know what you were doing, or you were in an identity crisis. That you had a deep sense that you were giving people access to the divine realities. That you were, as Max Weber, the sociologist, says, holding and organizing divine things. Obviously, we're not in that world right now. So, secular zero would not make ministry a difficult time right now. But this moves us forward, and this moves us closer to our own time, and we enter into what we might call secular one. Now, what is secular one? We could think of secular one like this. Remember your grandmother or maybe your mother told you that when you go to a dinner party like this, set up as a beautiful dinner party, when you're meeting people, as you're getting your food, you were told that there are 4 things you should not talk about at a dinner party. Remember what you were told? You were told when you're making polite conversation, do not ask someone how much money they make. Like that's just, you shouldn't do that. That is not a proper way to talk. For sure. Really, do not ask someone about their sex life. That would be very inappropriate as you're meeting someone in the line for fajitas to ask them about their sex life. The third thing, of course, that we're supposed to talk about, which is much harder in our day and age with 24-hour news, but you were told you shouldn't talk about politics. That politics is not a polite thing to talk about. And of course, the fourth and final thing you were told not to talk about, as you all know, you weren't supposed to talk about religion. Don't talk about religion. That's not a polite topic for meeting people at a dinner party. Now, the reason you don't talk about those 4 things at a dinner party is because it's assumed all 4 of those things are private things. They're private decisions made by people, and polite people do not talk about private things in public. So the secular really arrives when there becomes this distinction between what is public and what is private. What is public and what is private. And that shifts things significantly. Now belief itself becomes a private reality. And somehow the pastor now, or the minister, has to engage and cross a line into people's private worlds and help them make decisions to believe something or to commit to something or to spend their time doing something, that you have to kind of cross that line. It also means that what becomes really important, as you can hear me saying that, is that the will becomes really important. How do you get people to willfully decide, say, to stay committed to your church, or to willfully decide to raise their kids in the Christian tradition, or willfully decide to be part of this denomination? How do you get into their, somewhere in their rational willing mechanism becomes the real task of ministry. It also means that wills start to replace things as being imbued with the divine force. Now it's not things themselves that you're trying to get people near, but the actual kind of decision mechanisms. So you can think of this in the context of youth ministry. If you're really worried about your young people, back in a secular zero world, you'd think, hey, let's just get a relic. Get our kids near a relic. If we could get Peter's teeth, then all our kids would stay committed to church after graduation. We tend not to think that now. We tend to think, how, right? You guys don't think that? Maybe you do. We tend to think somewhere else about how do we help them believe this? How do we help them commit to this? All right, let me show you a video clip that maybe illustrates this transition from things to wills. So to set this up, this comes from the PBS NewsHour right after Notre Dame. This was right before COVID, I think. Notre Dame set ablaze. Remember in Paris when Notre Dame set ablaze? Now what they do is they interview you'll see her title come up. She's like the dean of the cathedral, the Parisian Episcopal Church or something. You'll see it come up. And listen to how she talks about this experience. It's a very different imagination than secular zero. Now I have to say this because some Episcopal bishops got really mad at me. I am not critiquing her, and if a camera was in my face, I would say the exact same thing that she is, and she might really be right. But think of how different it is than the world we just left, secular zero.
The laird is Dean of the American Cathedral in Paris.
It's brought out in all of us how much we care, not just about the building, which is gorgeous and historic, but about what it stands for. Paris, France, Europe, the world, tradition, Christian faith at its finest. Christian faith that endures.
The Dean is grateful that so many relics survived.
The relics are important, whether or not it really was Jesus' crown of thorns, for instance. Who knows? What's important is that it was a focus of faith, a focus of people's prayers for hundreds of years. So the things themselves are not so important as what they stand for, what they mean to people, the faith they evoke.
At present, the precise...
All right, you hear it, right? You hear it really clearly. And again, this is not to throw any shade on her. I would probably answer that exact same way, and maybe she's right. But what she says really highlights a transition. So she says, was it really Jesus' crown of thorns? Well, in some sense, it doesn't really matter. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. That's not what's important. What's important is that people seeing those crowns of thorns, they willfully consented. It moved them to prayer. It willfully got them to commit and to demonstrate what they believe. That's a big transition. The second transition that occurs is we move from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. And this time we move from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. The best way to illustrate this is, do you remember this date? January 31st, 2018. I mean, this is before the pandemic, I know, but if you are the pastor of a congregation, of course you remember this date. It's seared into your memory. Because you had never been more busy than the week before this in a couple weeks after it. Remember how busy you were? You've never done more pastoral care calls than during this time. It was crazy how many appointments, how many people you had to meet with. Remember? Yeah, you all looked really confused because none of you were. And you're all looking around being, I didn't have any pastoral care calls, did you? Well, this was the date of the super red blood moon. Remember that? The big, cool, Instagrammable moment? But that's the point. It becomes Instagrammable. When you live in a universe and not a cosmos, the idea is what this is doesn't necessarily have a message behind it. When you live in a cosmos, the idea is even the natural phenomenon speaks. And none of you had pastoral care calls because people don't live in that world. But you could imagine you could if you lived inside of a cosmos. No one called you and said, Pastor, we're thinking about transferring jobs and moving to Connecticut. But now that there's this super red blood moon, we're not sure if we should. Or, we've been trying to get pregnant, Pastor, but should we continue to do that because now there's a super red blood moon? Is God telling us not to do this or to do this? Pastor, we were thinking about doing a stewardship campaign, but now there's a super red blood moon and we're not sure if we should. No one asked you that. If they did, I'd love to talk to you after and see what you said. No one did, because the idea is that the natural phenomenon doesn't speak. We know what that is. It's really cool, and it's Instagrammable, so you take a selfie with it, but it's just, we know we have mathematical equations that tell us when this is. It becomes a very different context to do ministry in when you live in a universe and not a cosmos. When you are a pastor, when you're living in a cosmos, you have to interpret for people even the natural phenomena. That all slides away. So now in the secular one context, what you're really doing is helping people demonstrate what's private, public. And somehow your job as the pastor is to bridge the private world with the public. Now what happens is we move forward on this. And as this continues to develop, we move to what we might then call secular 2. And secular 2 is a really kind of radicalizing of this public-private divide, where it starts to become a battle between religious space and a-religious space. So we could define secular 2 as probably, if we did that exercise where you wrote your definition of the secular on a card, this is probably where most people, for sure most people in your church, would have defined it as secular 2. And so secular 2 is defined as fewer and fewer people are going to church. That what it means to live in a secular age is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. The reason being a pastor is so hard is because fewer and fewer people are going to church, and there's a battle between religious space and a-religious space. And you feel this on Sunday. It seems like particularly middle-class parents are more interested in their kid playing on a really good soccer team than going to Sunday school. And they're more interested in doing test prep to get into the right college than to be at youth group on Wednesday night. People are much more interested in their fantasy football team and being prepared for that than being at church on Sunday morning. And so in this kind of mindset, we start to think, how can we win people back? What do we have to do? How do my sermons need to be better? How do our programming need to be better? And we find ourselves in a kind of fight to win religious space over a religious space. Now, I had a student who was a pastor of a church in Minneapolis, and he told me he did a terrible, terrible thing. He made a terrible mistake for his own spiritual well-being as a pastor. What he did is he Googled his own church. Now, don't do this. It's a very terrible thing. He Googled his own church, and he discovered that there were 5 Google reviews to his church. Now, he did the worst thing, which he clicked on those and started reading those reviews. But he thought he was safe because he had 5, it was 4.5 stars out of 5. So he thought, hey, this must be pretty good. And he started reading them, and he did feel pretty good about it. It seemed pretty good. Except he got to the end, and he got this sinking feeling because he realized the way they were written was in the exact same format that you would write a review for an Airbnb. So it said, we love this church. They clean the carpets once a month. It's great. We love this church. They sanitize the nursery toys every week. We love this church. The preaching's pretty good, and it's worth driving 25 minutes for. And on it went. And he started to feel like, oh my gosh, this is not a good thing. And this becomes the issue when we see it as secular 2, when we define it as fewer and fewer people are going to church. Then your job as the pastor is to try to win people's commitment back, to try to grow the religious space over the a-religious space. Now here's what I think late at night here, as your dinner is sitting in your stomach. I'm not so sure what makes being a pastor or makes ministry hard right now is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. Now, I do think if you are overseeing any kind of ministry, this is an issue. It is an issue how many people are going to church, how are you going to make budget, how are you going to make sure people are paid, how to think about that. It does tell us something. But I don't think what it really means to live in a secular age is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. Rather, I think what it means to live in a secular age at its core, and what makes being a pastor right now so hard, is that we also live in a context of secular 3. So, just back to this, is that we could say it moves from demonstrate to participate. So you're always trying to get more and more people to participate, and you even judge yourself in your ministry as how many people are we getting to participate. Again, it's an issue, but I'm not sure it's really what it means to live in a secular age. Rather, what it means to live in a secular age is to inherit a world of secular 3. Now, what is secular 3? If secular 2 is fewer and fewer people are going to church, what secular 3 is a quite shared experience across our Western society where all belief, all forms of belief become contested. Or another way of saying this is that all belief becomes fragilized. So we live in a time where all of our beliefs are really quite fragile. Now what this constitutes is that inside of this fragilization of belief, there's both a positive and a negative reality to this. But I don't want you to think of that as like there's a good thing and there's a bad thing. Kind of think of it pejoratively. I don't want you to think of it like that. I want you to think of it like a battery, where it's got to have the plus and the minus, and this is where my electrical engineering knowledge comes to an end. I just know to get the remote control to work, to watch the TV shows I want, they got to be, positioned the right way. So the plus and the minus to this secular three-age is, the minus of this is inside a secular three-age, the sense that, the commitment that there is a larger transcendent reality, or that transcendence has some kind of pull on your life, becomes more and more unbelievable to people. The sense that there's a living God who could speak and move in history just becomes harder for people to even imagine how that's so. Now, the positive element of this is inside this kind of a secular society, there is a deep yearning for people to find meaning. They are on hunt to find some kind of significance in some kind of meaning. But all our belief becomes quite fragile. We're aware that the people across the street who don't go to church at all seem to be living a pretty decent life, and actually seem to be a more patient parent than you are. And we're really aware that, and we even sometimes go weeks and months without really believing or even thinking about God at all. So we're really aware that our beliefs can become quite fragile. Now, the person that I'm drawing on for this is the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, and he's written a 770-page book where he just wants to answer one question, if that doesn't make you sick to your stomach. He answer one question in 770 pages, and it's simply why 500 years ago, if you lived in the West, was it nearly impossible to not believe in God, where a short 500 years later, it's completely flipped. And it's easier to live in the West not believing in God than to believing in God. He said, how did that happen? And he wants to say we do now inherit a world where all our beliefs become fragilized. And what he means by this, and why it takes 770 pages, and some of us keep reading this book and finding new things in it, is because he says things like, this fragilization is a two-way fragilization. So it works like this. Let's say you're somebody who's grown up in the church. You show up most Sundays. You believe this stuff. You go to a Bible study. He says his point is that you at some point will find your belief fragilized. You will have those moments where you wake up in the middle of the night and you go, is this true? Or is this just the family I grew up in? And you'll find ways to cope with that. No, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. But it will come up. Another time it will come up and you'll think, do I believe this? Or is it just religion and an evolutionary trick? Is that all this is? No, I believe this. And his point is that all of us who believe at some point find ourselves with that belief fragilized. However, he says it works the other way too. Let's say you're a young adult who lives in Austin and you're working on your band and getting an app going. And you've been educated at an elite college. And let's face it, you know what religion is. Come on, you're a smart person. You know what religion is. It's just a historical reality used by people in power to keep other people down. That's all it is. And you know what happens when you die. I mean, my gosh, you went to an Ivy League school. You know exactly what happens when you die. It's like a TV set. When you unplug a TV set, it just goes black. That's what happens when you die. Get over it. Heaven is just made to cope with our psychological incapacity to deal with the fact that the world could go on without us. Taylor's point is, if that is you, that's you, says you too, first of all, your belief is that you don't believe. His point is, at some point, you will find that unbelief fragilized, and you will find yourself believing. For instance, you're invited to your nephew's Christmas concert, and you sit in the back of that concert hall, and all of a sudden that Bach music hits you in the chest, and you feel like something's grabbing for you, like there might be something more in the world. Or probably the most common one is that you have your first child, and you say to yourself, there's no meaning in the world. Come on. There's no meaning. I mean, it's actually good news that there's no meaning in the world. I don't know how that's good news, but some people think that. There's no meaning in the world at all. But then you hold that baby for the first time, and you find your unbelief fragilized, and you find yourself believing for a while. So it's a two-way fragilization. But Taylor's point, which I think he's really quite right on, is this is the environment in which you do ministry. An environment where if you believe, you find it fragilized, but also in a really interesting way, if you don't believe, you find that unbelief fragilized, and you find moments where you believe. But what we all inherit, whether we start as believing and doubting or not believing and doubting our doubts, is that we all inherit what he calls an imminent frame. Now this is what he says about an imminent frame, and there's good old Chuck Taylor. He says, an imminent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It's the circumscribed space of the modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. All right, you all have just gotten super tired. That is philosopher talk, and it is a scientific fact that there's tryptophan in philosophers' senses. So that makes you really tired, right? You kind of get it, but you kind of really don't get it. So let me try to help that make sense by showing you some lyrics from a pop star song. All right, now that makes me seem super cool, except this song is like from 2012, but just pretend it's really relevant and cool. But I don't know if you know this pop star, a British pop star named Lily Allen. So she had a song, like 12 years ago, but forget that point. And she had a song called The Fear. And listen to a couple of these lyrics, or hopefully you can see them at the bottom of the screen. Can you see that at the bottom? Some of you can't see that? I would move this table, but I'm afraid things would go really badly. So I will read this for you. This is what she says in one of her lyrics. She says, life's about film stars and less about mothers, but it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic, and that's what makes my life so effing fantastic. All right. Honestly, folks, I have no idea what that means. I'm not sure in any way, and I think it's a pretty dangerous thing to try to exegete pop stars' lyrics, so I don't really want to go too far in what that means. But it does mean, I don't know what packing plastic means. It probably means she has a credit card with a very large credit limit on it. More than likely, it means she's had a part of her body enhanced that therefore becomes the measure of the good life. But you get the kind of ethos of this, right? It's very irreverent. It's very kind of middle finger in your face. But this is the lyric I want to show you that gives us a kind of sense of what the imminent frame is. She says, I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. It's how I'm programmed to function. Now here it is, and hopefully at least this side of the room can see this. She says, now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. Now everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. I'm not a saint, and I'm not a sinner, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. This is the imminent frame. Now what you see in this lyric is that the categories of saint and sinner, she's not interested in that. They don't capture her imagination. Unlike Martin Luther, who in the very early 16th century quite literally could not sleep, tossing and turning in utter anxiety if he was a saint or a sinner. Went back to the book of Romans to read it over and over again to figure out if he was a saint or a sinner and what God thought of him and what his eternal destiny was. Here is this pop star from London who just simply doesn't care about the categories at all. They don't keep her awake. She never wakes up in the middle of the night staring at the ceiling in a cold sweat wondering if she's a saint or a sinner. But what's fascinating is she still wakes up in the middle of the night staring at the ceiling in utter abject anxiety and feeling under deep guilt. It's just not, what does an eternal God think of me? It's, summer's coming, swimsuit season's going to happen, how will people perceive me? This becomes very much what keeps her awake, our imminent and not a transcendent reality. That becomes what becomes significant. One of the reasons being a pastor is so hard, one of the reasons preaching is so hard, is I have the privilege of talking with a preaching group this afternoon, is because you do these practices, you lead this congregation inside of an imminent frame. And the kind of default mechanism that we all have from living in a Western world tends to be an imminent one as opposed to a transcendent one. That we tend to live inside of a natural material order than a supernatural order. And however you do ministry, you do it inside of this very environment. So Taylor says this, he says, we can't help looking over our shoulders from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. Now Lily Allen feels that doubt and uncertainty, so you get these verses where it's very irreverent, in your face, middle finger, I'm a weapon of massive consumption, it's not my fault, it's on a program to function, I'm packing plastic, and I'm not a saint, I'm not a sinner, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Yet in the chorus you get something very different. She says, I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When you think it all becomes clear, because I'm being overtaken by the fear. It's her moment too, even inside this imminent frame, even inside of the anxiety being more natural and material than supernatural or transcendent, she still has deep longings. deep questions. She still feels herself crossed up with wondering where the meaning is. She still needs someone to meet her in a significant way within this. Now, what we should do right now is I should play the song for you, right? Like that would just make all sorts of sense. But that would make too much sense, so I don't want to do that. I want to play another song for you that maybe illustrates further these issues and starts to land the plane for us in a group that no one knows. I didn't even know until some Canadian guy pointed it out to me. But this is a band called Purple Mountains, and the song I want to play for you is called Margaritas at the Mall. Now I want you to listen to the song, you'll hear the song, you'll see the lyrics come up. I want you to kind of pick out the lyric that you find most interesting or intriguing. But I do need to warn you before we listen to this, that I promise you this song, whether you like it or hate it, at some point in the next 5 or 6 days, this is my warning to you, it is going to be stuck in your mind. And you are going to wake up at 2 in the morning, or you're going to be washing the dishes, and you're going to start humming Margaritas at the Mall, and you are going to curse my name. But what I want you to do when that happens is I want to turn this into a spiritual exercise. And when you start to hum Margaritas at the Mall, and you can't get that song out of your head, and you get angry, I want you to pray. And I want you to say, God, are you telling me to go onto Amazon right now and buy an Andy Root book? I totally, that was a gross consumer joke, I'm sorry. All right, listen to this. He has a very much, that was a totally terrible joke. He has a kind of Johnny Cash feel to it, but listen to the lyric that kind of jumps out to you. Be aware of that. song will get deeply stuck in your head, and I apologize for that. But a very interesting song. So this is not someone who has any connection to a faith community at all. It's someone who's very much lived far outside the church or any religious community at all. And he raises some really deep questions. How long can the world go on under such a subtle God? And what this kind of secular age gives you is that you do get a kind of safe world. At least for some people, you get a very safe world. And you get margaritas at the mall. And margaritas are delicious. But that's all this stuff adds up to. And so you're released from a God who judges, and a God who speaks, and a God who moves history. But all you're given back in return are margaritas at the mall. And he wonders, how long can the world go on under such a subtle God? Here we are trotting the ground, the sod. He says, trotting the sod of the visible with no new word from God. Now this actually has quite a tragic ending, this song to it, because the young man who wrote the song and was in the band was a poet, which is really interesting. He was primarily a poet. And Charles Taylor always thinks the poet knows something. The poet reminds us there is a transcendent reality here, that the poet keeps us from reducing the world down flat. But what's quite tragic is that right after COVID started, he committed suicide. That living inside this world was just too flat for him. But what's also really fascinating against our secular 1, 2, and 3 is most people in ministry and most congregations and most ministry leaders have this kind of secular 2 mindset that really if our churches are going to survive, what we need to get people to keep coming is we need margaritas at church. Okay, maybe you don't say margaritas, but just replace margaritas with we need our own coffee shop. We need something that can attract people. We need it to feel like the mall. I mean, there was a whole movement within Protestantism to get our churches to feel like malls, to get more people to come and to participate. But what we see is that even doing that, making those steps, can in some ways make the imminent frame worse. And what we see, if we're right about this analysis in our cultural context, what people really yearn for is how to make meaning. Can they reach again for God? Can they be led by pastors and other leaders to try again to listen for a living God speaking? For those people, for us to make a claim that we think, maybe in great humility, that God still speaks and moves within this community, that God still is acting in our midst. I think in many ways that's how we need to respond inside of secular 3. But there's such a deep temptation to always turn these deeper issues into secular 2 issues. How can we just get margaritas at our church? How can we get people to participate? So it pushes us further in our pastoral practice that we have to kind of move towards, or we have a decision to make, whether we're really interested in people dwelling or we're going to lead them in searching. Or a more abstract way that Taylor talks about this, which we probably don't have too much time for, is he says, inside this imminent frame, you can close it down. You can close it down and say, there is really no meaning in it, there's no significance at all. Or you can have an open take, where you think, how does God still move in the midst of our experiences together? So instead of participate, maybe moving forward, what we need to do in ministry is help people believe again through deep encounters. Encounters with one another and encounters with a living God. And to make claims of the deep encounter with the living God we have, even in the midst of our doubts and our hopes, that the living God still encounters us and meets us. And I want to end with telling you one story that maybe illustrates that kind of believing again through encounter. So a few years ago, I went to Seattle to do some interviews for a book that I was writing. And I had read a book that maybe some of you have seen by an anthropologist named Tanya Lerman, T.M. Lerman. And she wrote this book, When God Talks Back. And it was really in anthropology where she joined 2 different vineyard churches, Pentecostal communities, and wanted to explore a community where they talk quite easily about God speaking to them. And she was very interested in looking at another divide we have in our culture, where we have most of the people in our culture find it very hard to take anyone seriously who says that God speaks to them. And then we have another slice of people who talk quite easily about God speaking to them. And the people that find it quite hard to imagine that God can speak to them find the people who say God speaks to them to be out of their mind, to maybe have a low-grade schizophrenia or something. So she wanted to analyze this. And she discovered that you really can't make any correlation between any kind of mental illness and people who talk about God speaking to them. And it was really a beautiful book. She ends by saying, listen, I'm a secular anthropologist from Stanford, so I'm not saying if God exists or not. That's not the point of my book. But I can tell you these people who say God speaks to them are not crazy. There's nothing crazy about it. Are they really talking to God? Is God really speaking to them? I don't know. But I can tell you that my father died during this research and they saw me through this. Their prayers for me really changed me. Now, I was really taken by it. And I thought, well, what would happen if you went to other communities that the kind of ethos of their community wasn't to reward people who said that God talks to them. So I decided to go and interview people at a Lutheran church and 2 Presbyterian churches. And so I went to Seattle and I did this thing called life history interviewing, where you just create about 8 big questions and you just have an hour-long conversation with someone, you record it on their permission, you transcribe it and look for themes. What was fascinating and highlights why I think ministry so much needs to take this focus on helping people believe again through encounter, is I asked these people, have you ever had an encounter with God? Have you ever felt like God spoke to you and led you? All of these people, most of them, almost all of them said, I hate it when people say that stuff. Like when anyone, I had a couple older gentlemen say, when anyone ever says God speaks to me, I just don't trust those people at all. But then they said, but there was one time. Everyone had at least a one-time story. And what was fascinating about it is that one-time story usually revolved around a kind of call into ministry. Not formally, but maybe informally. Like the man who said, I hate it. I don't trust anyone who says that God talks to them. But one time God did speak to me. I was raking my leaves, my yard. My best friend who lived across the street had lived across the street for 40 years. His wife died. And he was distraught, couldn't even get out of bed. And I heard God say to me, go tell Gus. And I went and I said this to him. They all had these stories. And then I said, well, they were amazing stories. I said, have you ever told anyone in your church these stories? Nope, never told anyone in my church one of those stories. I was shocked. I said, well, clearly you told your pastor, because your pastor was the person who nominated you to talk to me. You told your pastor. Nope, never told my pastor. Well, that's fascinating, that people actually have these encounters with the living God, and they don't share it with anyone. It doesn't feed its way back into the church. No wonder the intimate friend can feel so close. And you know what they often think their pastor really cares about? How do we get more people to participate? Not, what are these stories that are bringing life out of death for you? Well, the last interview I did was with a young woman. She's probably in her mid-30s, and she came into her pastor's office on a Sunday morning to have this hour-long conversation, and she came in annoyed from the jump. Like, she just did not look like she wanted to be there, and it wasn't going well. For the first 35 minutes of this thing, she just answered every question as quickly as she could. She clearly did not want to talk to me. And I thought, well, this happens. And, she kept saying, I'm so busy, I'm so tired, I have two young kids, I'm a single mom, and on and on she went. So I had the last 7 minutes, I decided I'd ask one more question and be done with it. And so her name was Rachel, and I said, so Rachel, thank you for all this, but the last time, have you ever had an experience where you felt really ministered to? Like so ministered to, you felt like it was the presence of Jesus Christ. And her whole disposition changed. And she said, I have. She said, I've never told this story to anyone. She said, I've been telling you throughout this interview that I'm a single mom, but I never told you why I'm a single mom. She said, I'm a single mom because 4 years ago, in 4 months, my husband went on a business trip. He flew from Seattle to Chicago. He was gone about 13 and a half hours and I got a phone call. On the other line was this young man from the hotel chain that he was staying at, and he was very nervous and he kept on saying, ma'am, my manager asked me to call you, and let me start over. So ma'am, your husband stayed here last night. Well, ma'am, so, ma'am, I've never done anything like this before. Ma'am, it seems there's been a terrible accident. Our cleaning crew went into your husband's room this morning, and he's unwell. Well, ma'am, he's dead. We called an ambulance. They came. They couldn't revive him. My manager's asked me to call you. He's dealing with all of everything, and he's asked me to call you and tell you that you need to come and identify your husband's body. She said as soon as she heard this, all the color in her living room just got sucked out of it. She had a toddler and a preschooler, and her first thought that came into her mind was, my life is over. She got out a little business card. She wrote the address to the hospital morgue that they had taken her husband's body. She hung up the phone. She called her mother to come stay with her children. She booked the flight. She was going to fly from Seattle to O'Hare. She was going to identify the body and get right back on a plane, make arrangements to get the body on the plane, and then she was going to get back to Seattle. She knew no one in Chicago. She said, I got on that plane. The flight lasted 13 minutes. It lasted 13 hours. She said, I didn't even know where it was. The grief was so heavy, I didn't even feel like I was in time. So I got to the O'Hare Airport. I walked down to the cab stand, and I gave the cabbie the business card with the address written on the back, and he drove. She said, I should have noticed this. She said, but I was drowning in grief. I didn't notice anything. I noticed that he parked the car. He didn't drop me off up front. But she said, I went in, and the people at the hospital morgue knew, they had my itinerary. They knew exactly when I was coming. And as soon as I came in, they took me back. And she said, I stood there, felt like an hour, but it was less than a minute. I stood there and waited. And I knew this was the moment. This is the moment my life would end. They wheeled in a gurney, and there it was, a body under a sheet. And she said, the man went to grab the sheet to reveal my husband's body and started to pull it back. And she said, just as that was happening, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and an arm came around the front with a water bottle. And she started crying, and she said to me, it was the cabbie. She said, it was the cabbie. She said, I never felt more ministered to in my whole life. She said, I got back on that plane, and I didn't know how I was going to go forward, but I knew, I was sure God would not abandon me. That I had experienced the presence of the living Christ in this moment. And she told me she had never told anyone that story. Inside of secular 3A, with all of its challenges, really what we do in ministry is seek these stories, invite people to share them, let them feed the church. Here she is, she believes again through an encounter with this cabbie that to her is the very concrete presence of Jesus Christ in her life. She is sure that she is not abandoned by God. And I honestly have no idea who that cabbie was. I have no way of ever finding it out. But he too needs a community. A church he can stumble into and say, I gotta tell you guys what happened to me. I was on my last run of the day, and I should have just dropped this woman off, and I should have been done with it. But I caught her eye in my rearview mirror, and I looked at the address, and I knew where she was going. Because I remember that place. My cousin Ronnie was taken there after he had his heart attack. And I remember my auntie throwing herself down on the ground and grieving when he's gone. And I thought to myself, she's going somewhere dark, and I can't let her be alone. I don't know what it was. He needs a community that says, that was the Holy Spirit. That was God moving. That was God calling you in to the place of the cross to participate in life for the sake, to participate in death for the sake of life. And that's who this God who comes to us in Jesus Christ is. The God who goes into death to bring life out of it, goes into impossibility to bring new possibility out of it. I do think people in secular 3, people who find all their beliefs fragilized, are yearning again to be led into seeking for a living God up against their doubt and their broken narratives and seeking for ministry with their neighbor. And I think it's enough. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for these people. However they leave tonight, may they leave knowing that you are well pleased. That their ministry is rich. We know, God, that they are exhausted, that they are hurt, bruised, and some wounded. But may we leave tonight knowing that ministry is a big calling. That we are given this gift of participating in a form of action that enters death and sees life come out of it. So we confess its difficulty, God, but we also live in gratitude for being called to proclaim your word.